The smoke rose from every chimney in the valley that October morning. Every chimney but one. Neighbors passing on the road noticed it first. Not the silence. Silence was common enough in a place like that. What they noticed was the direction. Margaret Hale was not carrying firewood down toward her cabin. She was carrying it up, load after load, on a flat-back sled she had built herself from 2 fence rails and a length of rope, dragged uphill through the frost, disappearing into the tree line above the property, and returning empty. Caleb Hurst watched from his fence post for nearly an hour one afternoon before calling out to ask what she was doing. She told him she was putting things where they belonged. He did not ask again. That was the 3rd week of October. The first serious snow came 11 days earlier than anyone expected, and when the blizzard arrived in November, the kind that sealed roads and silenced valley for weeks at a time, the cabin at the foot of that hill sat dark and cold, its door hanging open, appearing to every passing eye as abandoned. Margaret was not in the cabin. She was not frozen in a field. She was not gone. What she had built above that tree line was not a second home. It was not a fortress. It was not even a proper shelter in the way most people would use the word. It was something older than that, something she had found by accident, understood slowly, and prepared for a year and a half without telling anyone. And when the valley finally dug itself out and 2 men climbed the hill to check on her, they did not find what they expected. If you are watching from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are. Stories like this survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if this kind of frontier wisdom matters to you, subscribing helps keep it alive. Margaret Hale was 41 years old when the second winter after her husband's death began to close in. She was not old by the measure of hard years, and she was not weak by any honest accounting. She had split her own since the spring of the previous year, had managed a garden, had kept 2 goats and a flock of 7 hens through the cold months without help from anyone. But the cabin Thomas had started was not the cabin he had finished, because Thomas had not finished it. He had died in August, 14 months before the October we're talking about, of a fever that came fast and left faster, taking him before the cellar was dug, before the east wall was fully chinked, before the woodshed roof was anything more than a frame. The community had come for the burial. Several men had offered to help in the weeks after. A few had followed through. Most had not. By the time the first real frost arrived that year, Margaret had understood something that she would not have put into words, but carried quietly from then on. Help offered in grief is not the same as help delivered in cold. She did not blame them. People had their own families, their own failing roofs, their own winters to prepare for. But she stopped waiting for them to come back. She began instead to pay attention to things she had previously left to Thomas. How long the fire lasted on a given night, which direction the wind came from when the temperature dropped fastest, where the frost settled first on the ground, and where it arrived last. She kept no formal record, but her memory was careful, and by the 2nd October she had accumulated a set of observations that she trusted more than any advice offered from a road. One of those observations was about the cave. She had discovered it in the summer of the year Thomas died, before the fever, when there was still reason to walk the upper property together. But it was not Thomas who found it. It was their dog, a brown and gray cattle dog named Prine, who had gone missing for 3 days in late June and returned smelling of cold stone and something deep. Margaret followed the tracks the next morning. The entrance was small, narrow enough that she had to turn sideways to enter, and it opened after about 6 feet into a chamber roughly the size of a modest root cellar, maybe 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep, with a ceiling she could stand under in the center, but not near the edges. The floor was packed earth and flat stone. The walls were solid limestone, cool to the touch even at midday in July. She had told Thomas about it. He had gone up to look. He said it was interesting, and that they might use it for something someday. That someday never came for him. But Margaret remembered the temperature of those walls in July. She remembered the way sound changed inside, the way the air moved differently, the way it held a kind of quiet that was different from the quiet of an empty room. A room goes cold without heat. The cave simply stayed the same. She did not think of it again until the following spring, when she lost 2 bushels of potatoes to a freeze that hit faster than she had expected, penetrating the corner of the cabin where she had stacked them near the floor. She sat with the rotted pile for a long time, calculating what she had lost and what she would have to replace it with, and somewhere in that calculation the cave appeared again in her memory. By summer, she had begun to think about it differently, not as a shelter, not as a place to live, as a place to put things that needed to survive. The first load she brought up in August was experimental. 3 cured hams wrapped in cloth, a seal crock of lard, 2 wax seal jars of preserved cherries. She placed them on a raised platform she built from flat stones and a length of rough-cut board, keeping everything off the direct floor. She checked them 2 weeks later, then again at the end of the month. The temperature inside the cave held what she estimated was somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit to the whole August, when the cabin itself grew stifling and her outdoor larder sweated and strained against the heat. Nothing spoiled, nothing softened. The sealed jars were exactly as she had left them. She did not tell anyone, not because she was ashamed or secretive by nature, but because she understood in a quiet and precise way that what she was building depended on being the only one who knew about it. A shared reserve is a reserve that gets borrowed from. A borrowed reserve runs out before the crisis it was meant for. Through September, she moved methodically. Firewood was the most difficult. Green wood was useless, and she did not have enough seasoned wood to split between the cabin and the cave. She made a decision that looked, from the road, like carelessness. She moved the oldest and driest wood, the wood she had been saving for the hardest nights, up to the cave, and kept the newer cut wood near the cabin for daily use. Caleb Hurst, who farmed the adjacent property, asked her about it twice. The second time, he was not unkind, but he was direct. He told her the cave was a poor place for wood, that moisture would come up through stone, that animals would find it before spring, that she was wasting the best of her supply on a location she could not reach in a real storm. Margaret listened to all of it. Caleb was not a foolish man. He had good reasons for what he said. She thanked him and kept going. What Caleb did not know, what no one knew except Margaret, was that she had already solved the moisture problem. The wood sat on a raised frame of split rails, elevated 4 inches from the stone floor, with the entrance partially blocked by a low, dry stack wall of flat rocks that broke the wind without sealing the airflow. She had watched the condensation patterns on the walls through 3 weeks of rain in September and placed her storage away from the seep lines. The cave breathed slowly, consistently, and would stay dry in a way it never did in the open woodshed with its warped and incomplete roof. She had learned this not from any book or any instruction. She had learned it from watching the walls and touching them, and coming back the next day and touching them again. The argument, if it can be called that, happened at Danner's feed store in the 2nd week of October. Margaret had come in for a small order of salt and to pay down a portion of her summer account. Harlan Cross was there, a rancher with 300 acres on the south end of the valley and opinions to match. He was not a cruel man, but he was the kind of man who spoke in certainties, and certainties have a way of narrowing into something cruel when they are aimed at someone with fewer options. He had heard about the cave project from Caleb. He said it plainly, without embarrassment. He thought she was making a serious mistake. Caves, he said, were not temperature stable in the way people imagined. They flooded. They collapsed on a sustained ground freeze. They attracted mountain lions and bears looking for winter shelter. They were inaccessible in deep snow. A woman alone would have no way of reaching a cave above the tree line if a real blizzard came through. And if the food and wood were up there when the crisis hit, she would be in the cabin with nothing. Every single argument Harlan Cross made that afternoon was reasonable. Margaret bought her salt. She asked the price of an additional length of rope. She paid what she owed. On her way out, she stopped at the door and said, without turning around, that she appreciated the concern. Then she left. What she had not said, what she thought about on the walk home, was that every argument Harlan had made assumed she would be in the cabin when the crisis came. That was the assumption she was trying to make wrong. The cave was not a supplement to the cabin. The cave was a contingency for when the cabin failed. She was not planning to wait in the cabin until conditions improved. She was planning to be somewhere better before conditions made the choice for her. The interior of the cave changed through October in ways that took her time to understand. The walls, which had been cool through the summer, grew colder as the outside temperature dropped. But they did not grow cold as fast as the air. For several weeks in early October, the stone was actually warmer than the night air outside, holding the memory of the warmer months in a way that the cabin walls, thin wood, poorly chinked, never did. Margaret noticed this first by accident. She had brought a lantern up one evening to reorganize the food stores and found herself removing her coat inside the cave because the air was not as biting as she had expected. She stood still for a moment, tried to understand why. The stone was not generating heat. It had no fire, no living warmth of its own. What it was doing was releasing, slowly and steadily, the warmth it had absorbed during the months before. The cave was not warm because of anything she had done. It was warm because of what it had already been. She built a small test fire near the entrance on a calm evening in mid-October, using a handful of dry pine splits. The smoke moved outward, drawn by the natural flow of air rising from the chamber. Good. The draft worked without a chimney. She watched the walls for an hour after the fire went out. They held the warmth longer than she expected, not dramatically longer, but long enough to matter in a sustained cold. She added 2 wool blankets to the storage that week, then a spare set of boots wrapped in canvas, then the last of the medicinal herbs she had dried in August, then a small tin box containing documents, the deed to property, Thomas's death record, a letter she had written to her sister that she had never sent. She was not moving into the cave. She was preparing it as the place she could survive from, if the cabin could no longer serve that purpose. The distinction seemed obvious to her. It seemed insane to everyone else. The snow began on a Thursday evening in the first week of November. That was not unusual for the valley. What was unusual was that it did not stop on Friday. It continued through Saturday, through Sunday, driven by a wind that came from the north and then shifted northwest, and then due north again, unpredictable and relentless, filling the road to Danner's before anyone had properly prepared for it. Margaret had been watching the skies since Tuesday. She had seen something in the cloud formation over the ridge, a particular flatness, a particular gray, that she associated with duration rather than intensity. She could not have explained the science of it. She had simply seen that kind of sky before, in the winter 2 years prior, and remembered what followed. On Wednesday evening, she made her last trip to the cave with the sledge. She brought the remaining dried venison, a sealed tin of rendered tallow, 3 extra candles, and a small hand mirror. She rearranged the wood to make a clear path from the entrance to the fire spot near the inner wall. She stacked the food in order what would last longest on the outside, and what needed the most stable temperature closest to the back. She blocked the lower third of the entrance with the rock wall she had been building and adjusting since August, leaving only the upper portion open for air. She returned to the cabin and slept. By Friday morning, the road was gone. By Friday afternoon, the east window of the cabin had iced over on the inside. She kept the fire in the cabin going through Friday and into Saturday, burning the newer wood, the stuff that was meant to go first. She was not panicking. She was calculating. The cabin could hold for a certain number of days, depending on how cold it got and how long the storm lasted. The cave could hold for longer if she reached it while she still had the strength to climb. On Saturday evening, With the fire low and the temperature inside the cabin dropping below what she judged safe for sleeping, she made her decision. She was going up. It was not heroic. It was not the kind of thing that looks the way it feels from the inside. She dressed in everything warm she owned, wrapped the outer layer in a length of oilcloth she had bought in September specifically for this purpose, tied it at the waist with a rope, and went out the back door into a darkness that was less dark than usual because the snow reflected whatever thin light came from the sky. The distance from the cabin to the cave was approximately 400 yards. Under normal conditions, she could walk it in under 10 minutes. That evening it took her close to 45 minutes. The snow was above her knees in the open area near the cabin, and above her waist in the drifts near the tree line. She fell twice. The second time she lay still for a moment and thought about the tin box with the deed and the letter, and decided that was not a useful thing to be thinking about, and got back up. The cave entrance was partially drifted, but not sealed. The stone wall she had built to block the lower portion had done its work. The drift had piled against the outside of the wall, and the interior remained passable. She pushed through the upper gap and pulled her supplies in after her. Inside, the air was cold, but it was a different kind of cold than the wind. It was still. It was a kind of cold that a fire can speak to directly, without fighting the wind for every degree of warmth. She built the fire carefully, using the smallest and driest of the pine splits, feeding it slowly, watching the smoke move toward the entrance and out. The draft held. The walls began, within the hour, to accept the warmth. She ate a small amount of dried venison. She wrapped herself in both blankets. She set the lantern low and sat with her back against the warmest section of wall, the one farthest from the entrance, where the stone had been holding heat the longest, and waited to see what the morning would bring. The morning brought more snow. She stayed. The exact count was 11 days. She knew this because she made a mark on the cave wall each morning when she woke, using a piece of charred stick from a fire, not from any anxiety about losing track, more because she found it grounding, proof that time was still moving, that the storm was finite, that she was still a person with the capacity to count. The fire consumed approximately 1/4 of it over the 11 days, burning in a managed rhythm she developed by the third day, a larger fire in the morning and evening, a smaller maintenance fire through the night, and a resting period in the afternoon when the walls were warm enough to hold without additional fuel. The cave never became warm in any comfortable sense, but it held at a temperature above freezing with consistency that she found remarkable. By the 5th day, she understood something she had not fully anticipated. The cave was not just protecting her from the storm. It was protecting her from the effort of fighting the storm. The cabin, in a sustained blizzard, would have required constant vigilance, keeping the fire roaring against a drafty structure, monitoring frozen water, managing ice on the inside of the walls, managing the smoke that would back up when the wind shifted. The cave asked less of her. It had no drafts to fight. The air moved on its own terms, in a predictable pattern that she learned within 2 days and stopped worrying about. She had time to rest. That turned out to matter more than she had expected. On the 8th day, the wind dropped. On the 9th, the snow stopped. On the 10th, a pale sun appeared for 3 hours in the afternoon, and she sat near the entrance and felt it on her face without going out. On the 11th morning, she gathered her things, repacked what she would bring back, and made note of what remained. Still enough food for 2 more weeks, still roughly half her would supply. She came down the hill carrying her blankets in the tin box, wearing all her layers, and arrived at the cabin to find the door she had left shut now standing open. Inside, the fire was long dead. 2 inches of snow had blown through the door gap. A pair of boot tracks led from the entry to the kitchen and back, with a note left on the table in Caleb Hurst's handwriting. Gone to find her, God willing. She put the note in the tin box with the deed and the letter. Then she built a fire in the cabin and made tea. Caleb Hurst returned from his search the following afternoon with Harlan Cross and the pastor's eldest son, all three of them having spent 2 days combing the lower fields and the creek line in the assumption that she had frozen somewhere in the open. When they found her at the cabin table, drinking tea from a chipped enamel cup with both hands wrapped around it, Caleb sat down very suddenly, the way a man does when his legs decide, without asking him. No one spoke for a long moment. Margaret offered them tea. Harlan declined. The pastor's son accepted. She did not offer a full explanation that afternoon. She said she had been in a sheltered place. She said she was well. She said she was sorry to have caused alarm, though her tone suggested she was not entirely sorry, in the way of someone who knew the alarm had also been a kind of proof. The conversation that followed was shorter than the silence that surrounded it. Harlan Cross left without comment. Caleb stayed to help restock her woodpile from a stack he had brought on a sled. He did not ask about the cave. He did not look toward the hill. He simply worked, and when the work was done, he said he was glad she was all right, and went home. The following spring, Margaret showed the cave to 2 women from the upper part of the valley, a younger widow named Claire and an older woman named Edna, who had homesteaded alone for 9 years and trusted her own observations the way other people trust a sermon. Margaret walked them through the stone wall at the entrance, the raised platform for the wood, the seep lines to avoid, the fire position, the way the draft moved, and what it meant about airflow. Neither of them asked who had taught her. In the autumn of the following year, both of them had built their own reserves. Not caves. Neither of their properties had the right geography, but cellars dug into hillsides with similar principles. Stable temperature, protected from wind, stocked before the crisis rather than during it. As for Harlan Cross, he said nothing publicly about the cave or about Margaret Hale. He had made his arguments in front of witnesses, and those witnesses had spent 2 days searching a frozen valley for a woman who did not need to be found. Late that October, Margaret found a stack of oak rails left at the bottom of her road. No note, good straight rails, already split, the kind that would last years on a raised platform. She recognized the wood. She carried it up the hill. The cave had never been about surviving one storm. It had been about understanding before the storm came, where the cold was actually allowed to enter, and making sure that place was not where she slept. Harlan had been right about almost everything. He had been wrong about the one thing that mattered, that she had nowhere better to go. The wall was not beautiful. It was patient. And that winter, patience was enough. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.